Most of us are familiar with the tourist attractions of St. Louis, Kansas City, and Branson, but there are lots of great places to visit in rural Missouri as well. We'll find out more next on Show Me Ag. Welcome to Show Me Ag. I'm your host, Kyle Vickers. Thanks for joining us. We have as our guest tonight John Drake Robinson. He's a lifelong Missourian serving in Missouri government, including a stint as the Missouri Director of Tourism. He has devoted several years to traveling all the back roads of Missouri, and he's written 2 books about his travels. He's with us tonight to share some insights while traveling rural Missouri. John, thanks for being with us.
Hey, it's great to be here, Kyle.
I understand you have a claim to make about how many places you've been in Missouri.
Well, over 13 years, I have driven every mile of every road in Missouri on the Missouri state map. So I've been in 700 plus Missouri towns, all of them.
All the interstate highways, all the 2-lane highways, all the back road,
right down to the blacktops, and a lot of gravel roads, a lot of dirt roads, and low water crossings. So,
there's a lot of them in Missouri.
There are a lot, and I was fortunate enough not to get stuck in any of them.
or shot or otherwise harmed.
Well, that's right. That could happen. Although, for the most part, I emerged relatively unscathed and had a great time.
Quite a task. Like you said, 250,000 miles all over the state.
Right.
What inspired you to do this?
Well, I didn't wake up one day and decide I was going to do this. It was an obsession, and as anybody knows, OCD doesn't happen overnight. If any of your friends or relatives have it, you know that it's an evolutionary thing. I got out my map one time because I thought I had been to a lot of places in Missouri, so I traced the roads I'd been on. And what I was surprised to see is that I hadn't been on near as many places as I thought. So I just kept the map and kept track. In various jobs that I had, if I had a trip from Columbia to St. Joe, for example, or to Branson, if I had the luxury of time over a weekend or something, I would take the back roads to get there and then maybe another route home. And I would mark those off my map. But it was a big map and a lot of roads. And so it took me the better part of 13 years to complete the mission.
I am constantly amazed at what a beautiful state we have.
Gorgeous.
I'm sure you have seen a lot of wonderful sights in Missouri.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what are some of your favorites?
Well, you know, I'm partial because I grew up in the Ozarks. I am partial to the Ozark rivers. My favorite place is the Upper Jacks Fork River, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers would agree with that. But you know, one of the other interesting things is that sometimes people think that north of the Missouri River or north of I-70 that there's not much to see, and that's absolutely not the case. In fact, there are many, many beautiful areas in North Missouri, especially around the river valleys like the Sheraton River Valley, the Grand River Valley, various areas like that. Some wonderful things that people just aren't aware of.
I want to come back and talk about some of these places, but you know, we're an ag show. We normally focus on agriculture.
Sure.
I know as you've traveled around, there's vineyards, there's orchards. We've got a lot of wonderful agricultural sites in Missouri, don't we?
You know, ag and tourism intersect in a lot of different ways. That it's always been there, but people never used to talk about it. When I was director of tourism, we started doing agritourism in a big way. And of course, one of the biggest agritourism industries is the winery business. And as many viewers will know, wineries and actually vineyards used to be very big in Missouri after the Civil War in the early 1800s. Prohibition put a damper on that a little bit, but the wineries are back and the vineyards are back.
Tremendous growth in the number of acres of grapes being grown, as well as the number of wineries that you can visit.
And they're award winners too.
Yes,
yeah,
high quality wines.
Absolutely. And the Norton grape actually has two great distinctions. First, it's a wonderful red, the Norton Cynthiana, whichever you want to call it. But the other thing is it single-handedly saved the French wine industry when they had a scourge, a nematode that the Norton rootstock is impervious to that. So they actually grafted Missouri roots to the French vineyard vines and saved the French wine industry.
I know many of these wineries are welcoming people not only to come and buy their wine and taste their wine and enjoy maybe a meal or whatever, but also to visit their vineyards. It's kind of the whole concept of inviting folks out to a farm is a little bit different, but something that's really coming on strong.
Well, it is, and not just wineries, although that's one of the more fun things to do, to spend an afternoon or a weekend, but there are also pumpkin patches in the fall. There are areas where you can do the
corn mazes.
Yeah.
What a good segue, because before we continue any farther, I'd like you to take a moment to introduce you to Jay and Kim Fischer of Fischer Farms Pumpkin Patch and Corn Maze just outside Jefferson City. They've turned their modest row crop operation into a seasonal tourist attraction. Located just north of the Missouri River in the state capitol building near Jefferson City, they take pride in educating and entertaining kids of all ages.
I started raising pumpkins. It was a project with my grandpa, and probably when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, something like that. And we raised, it was kind of a little money-making project, and we raised pumpkins to sell to some local grocery stores, hardware stores. He always grew. He was kind of a truck gardener, and he grew fresh produce, but the pumpkins were always mine, and I got to keep the money from it. So that's kind of how it all got started.
This is our 10th year of doing the corn maze and the pumpkin patch. We have done the pumpkins for about 18 years now, selling them to the grocery stores. And but as far as field trips and the corn maze, it's been about 10. And I run the field trips during the week for the schools, Monday through Friday, and then on Friday evenings we open to the public with the corn maze and the pumpkin patch, and we run that on Friday evenings, Saturdays, and Sundays. We also have Clydesdale horses. We bring in some goats during the fall. We buy baby chickens, and we have a calf. And we have a cotton box and a 250 bushel corn box that the kids play in. They can take their own wagons out to the pumpkin patch and pick their own pumpkins. We have an apple and peach orchard that are available in the fall. And of course we plant watermelons, and we try to plant some late ones, so we have those for fall, and then we do a late garden, so we try to have fresh produce also.
When I grew up, I kind of grew up with my grandfather, and loved everything. He loved anything outdoors or about the farm, and he was all about growing things. He had cattle, and I thought, you know, I enjoyed that so much growing up, and kids today don't have the opportunity, you know, even though they live in the middle of kind of a rural area, they don't know a lot about where their food comes from. And I think if they come out to our place or to anybody's place like ours, they can learn, you know, how a pumpkin's not just a pumpkin out of a box at Walmart. Watermelon's just not a watermelon off the shelf at Walmart, and we just try to give them a little education, a little educational thing while they're here having a good time.
Well, I think these days kids don't really know what a farm is. Everything comes from the grocery store. So if you bring them out here and they see an animal, then they might know that's possibly where their food comes from. I take them out on a hay ride, and they actually get to go out and pick a pumpkin off of the vine in a gourd instead of out of a box at a grocery store. They actually see how it's grown, and they'll see the blooms still on the ones that haven't produced pumpkins yet. And so I kind of teach them actually where the pumpkins grow, so they know that it's on a farm and not in a box at the grocery store.
Knowing what sustains our lives every day, and food is a huge a huge portion of that, and to know where your food comes from and to know that it's important to buy food locally, and anytime you can avoid having it shipped in from another country, and support the people here at home, I think is important.
Thanks to Kim and Jay for letting us join them on their farm, and a special thank you to Kim for the photographs she provided us. Their season typically runs from the last Friday in September to the first Sunday in November. And in addition to a Facebook page, the Fischers also have a blog at the address below. John, this is exciting for me to see these people willing to invite folks out to their farm. It's an educational process. It's a great family activity. I know there's a lot of those opportunities around Missouri.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing that one of the most famous people in the world, Mark Twain, Missourian, said, if you want to see Missouri at her best, see her in October. Mm-hmm. So when you get a chance to go on these farms during a harvest, it's pretty special. The colors aren't bad either.
But there's things going on around rural Missouri all year long. Tell us a little bit about some of the fun places you visited.
Oh, driving off the beaten path, so often we get in a rut. We stay on the interstate. Our drive to work and back is the same route, and we're wearing deep grooves in the route that we do. But there are so many neat places to do, and in my books, I talk about some of the places that I went to. For example, one that I'm not sure is there anymore, and sometimes this will happen, but I was driving through Drexel, Missouri one time, a small town on the western border just south of Kansas City, and I saw this sign that said Frontier Military Museum, and it was in a shed, a barn. I stopped, and it was the most amazing experience I'd ever seen. Inside were all of these saddles from the Civil War and various other conflicts and situations. Now, if that's not there, maybe there's another museum that has taken its place or that you can find. The state park system in Missouri is wonderful. If you're in Clay County and you're thinking about retracing the steps of Jesse and Frank James.
Just north of Kansas City.
Just north of Kansas City, don't pass up Watkins Woolen Mill, which is the most complete, functional woolen mill from the post-Civil War era, and it is absolutely fascinating.
Boy, as we've traveled Missouri, we're kind of Civil War buffs without being really professional at it, but
right.
All across Missouri, I think maybe second in the nation in the number of Civil War battles that went on somewhere here. It's really fascinating to follow that history, isn't it?
Absolutely, and in almost every town that you go into in Missouri, there is a story from the Civil War, and obviously it was a tragic time, but many of these communities have preserved their Civil War history, and certainly river towns like Glasgow and Lexington and Centralia, the famous Battle of Centralia, which featured some scurrilous characters like Bloody Bill Anderson and a kid named Jesse James. The history is there, and the interesting thing about it is when you go to these small communities, stop in the mom and pop restaurant. Maybe it's during coffee time. Sit down with the folks in that area, and they will be happy to tell you about the history. And you'll learn some things about that community and the surrounding areas that you didn't know and that you'll want to see.
Well, when you think about Missouri, it was such a pivotal point in westward expansion. Of course, we have the arch at St. Louis that celebrates that.
Absolutely.
But you have the Lewis and Clark expedition, all the upward migration along the rivers. It's all pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. Most of the major trails started in Missouri and actually in central Missouri.
New Franklin, Boonville area.
Right, exactly. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and they went through Independence. You can still see the swales, the wagon ruts, leaving Independence when you go to the National Trails Museum in Independence.
And it's I've been to several states. You mentioned earlier you'd been to all 50.
Yeah.
I haven't got there yet, but part of the reason I love to travel Missouri, very scenic, some of the most beautiful rivers, bluffs, forests around.
You know, people say that too, and in surrounding states, they say, you know, I love my state, but when I come to Missouri, it is so diverse and has so much beautiful scenery, and I couldn't agree more. I love the rivers, and obviously spend a lot of time on Missouri rivers, especially in the Ozarks, but the Ozarks gets talked about a lot, and there's a lot of things going on, but there are other places that are just as dramatic.
Talk to us a little bit more about some of the other places, well, particularly this part of Missouri that you've visited, West and West Central Missouri.
West and West Central Missouri. Well, for example, Arrow Rock. I think a lot of people are familiar with Arrow Rock and the history of Arrow Rock, from Bingham to one of the greatest professional theater shows, certainly in the Midwest. Boonville is a very historic town, as is Glasgow. And some of the interesting things there are the buildings that survive, that are on the National Register, but they speak volumes about the history, and there are people who are willing to tell you about that. Also in this area, some of the viewers would be familiar with Blackwater, but if you haven't been to Blackwater, Missouri, it is a case study in how a town can come back. It's a very small town, off the beaten path. It was a railroad town, so when there were passenger rails, Blackwater did a pretty brisk business, but it fell on hard times until the mayor of Blackwater basically took the town and said, here's what we're going to do, and the community coalesced around it. Now it's got a wonderful old hotel, the Iron Horse Hotel. You can get a great meal in Blackwater, a lot of shops, not a lot of shops, but the main street has several shops, and you can spend a wonderful day off the beaten path in Blackwater.
Okay, you mentioned a wonderful meal. Now, when we travel, we like to stop at good places to eat, and there's some of them scattered in places you might not expect around Missouri.
Well, what impressed me is around every corner there's a surprise. But I had been through Higginsville, which is kind of a neat town in its own way. It has a lot of history. I went past the Red Shanty, which is right there on Highway 13 in Higginsville. But I took a detour and went out past Corder, Missouri, and actually ended up at a place called the Dancing Bear Cafe. Now, it was closed when I was there, so I had to go home, Google it, find out when they were open, call the chef, and arrange for reservations when they were open, but had a wonderful meal in the Dancing Bear Cafe, which is a converted chicken house. Now, it doesn't sound like it might be appetizing, but it actually was a very wonderful experience.
And Corder's not a very big town.
Small town, small town, but that's the thing. Small town Missouri, small town America for that matter, but especially small town Missouri still has that character. And we owe it to ourselves and to the people of these small towns to visit these places, actually spend a little money in these communities.
You talk about the diversity of topography and forests, but really we have a great diversity of people in Missouri as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, Missouri is the westernmost eastern state, the easternmost western, same for north and south. I grew up in the Ozarks, and you can probably hear the Ozark twang still in my voice. Very hardy people that grew up in isolation. Even when I was a child, it was not the way it is now. It was before texting and the internet and that kind of thing. The world is changing, but you can still see the culture and heritage in these various areas of Missouri.
And that's interesting to me. I know Herman is a very Germanic community.
Absolutely.
Still some German languages spoken in that area.
Indeed.
And yet around Missouri, we have these different cultures that build up in locales.
Sure, and of course in the cities there are neighborhoods that represent various ethnic groups. But you talk about Herman, you know, Herman had, it was settled by Germans because the Missouri River reminded them of their homeland, and it was also a good place to grow grapes. So we get back to the vineyards, and of course still along that entire corridor from Augusta, Washington, Missouri, which is another great town to visit, and Herman. But you get over along the Mississippi, you know, people are familiar with Hannibal. and Mark Twain, as they should. And that's a wonderful weekend to spend in Hannibal. But you go south of there to Clarksville, Missouri, a very small town, about 500 people. But there are probably more artisans per capita in Clarksville than just about anywhere else on earth. And you can see glass blowers and pottery makers and jewelry makers, chair makers in this small town of Clarksville, which is tucked under the bluffs along the Mississippi River.
Beautiful drive, and
Yes,
in the spring and fall, a lot of eagle viewing along the
Oh, absolutely. And the eagles are back, too. In fact, you know, you can see them along the rivers and lakes right here in central Missouri as well.
We do. We see eagles more every year. It's
Sure.
just, it's kind of amazing. A lot of famous people from Missouri, and there's some shrines and some notorious people, as well as people like President Truman. Those are places to visit as well.
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned Truman. Obviously, VE Day has just passed, May the 8th, and we'll be celebrating VJ Day this summer, too. The Truman Library is one of the most fascinating museums anywhere, and they have done a wonderful job of presenting life as it was, especially right now. They're talking about 1945, the end of the war, and the very momentous time that Harry Truman found himself smack dab in the middle of. So he is obviously a very prominent character in Missouri history. But once again, you mentioned, you know, one of the things that I think would be fun this summer, and you're looking for a weekend trip. You start here in central Missouri. You can start in Warrensburg and learn the story of man's best friend and see the statue of Old Drum on the courthouse grounds. Not far from Warrensburg is Marshall, which is the final resting place of Jim the Wonder Dog. And if you don't know about Jim the Wonder Dog, he was probably smarter than most of us. He could predict the winners in 7 straight Kentucky derbies, and he dumbfounded the Missouri legislature, which, you know, you can argue that might not be that difficult, but he was a smart dog. Well, his final resting place is in Marshall. But you go on to Kirkwood, Missouri, just outside of St. Louis, and it is the AKC National Museum of the Dog. And the neat thing about all of these museums and places is your pets are welcome, you know, so that's fun.
You were talking about Truman. I don't want to neglect to do a shout out for Lamar, Missouri, where his birthplace is commemorated.
Absolutely.
His house is still, I've been there a couple of times. It's very fascinating where he grew up.
Lamar is a wonderful community, and they've done a good job, and the Truman House is there, a very historic place. There are Truman, of course, in Grandview as well. The old Truman Farm is a national historic site. And Independence has a lot of history, and they present their history very well, too. So the small communities are great, the larger communities as well.
I'm drawing a blank here. There's a town in North Missouri that Disneyland has a connection to.
Marceline.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you know, when I was director of tourism, I was at various conferences, and I'd say I'm from Missouri, and people would say, well, who would want to go to Missouri? And I said, well, all right. Have you ever been to Disney World? Oh, yeah, I've been to Disney World. I said, and probably Disneyland, too? Yeah. I said, well, you know, after you've visited them, come to Marceline and see the real Main Street that the main streets in these places were patterned after. And some people took very loving care, not the least of which was Walt himself, to preserve his boyhood home, which he said he had more happy memories there than just about any place on earth. You can go see his dreaming tree, the original shed, the clubhouse. It's a replica, but it is the one that, as we grew up being Mouseketeers, would see on TV. All of that stuff, the old picture show, which is the original picture show, is still there in
a lot of these fascinating places across the state. I want to mention that John has written a couple of books, and they are available that are out in paperback, and you can have. And then you also do some work, I guess, on behalf of the Missouri Department of Conservation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Department of Conservation, well, based on the books and the fact that I'd traveled every mile of every road in Missouri, I'd done a lot of talking about far-flung places and wilderness in Missouri, and there's a lot of wilderness in Missouri. So my second book, especially, Coastal Missouri, talks about the wilderness. The Department of Conservation was intrigued, and my car actually went with me every step of the way. It's got a name, Arifnus Catenop, but they were intrigued by the fact that Arifnus and I had done all of these travels to various wilderness areas. The Department of Conservation wanted to engage people who had basically lost their way. They were so urban that they had never been out into wilderness Missouri. And so I am a spokesperson, if you want to call it that, to do things. It's called Finding Wild Missouri, and it's online. If you Google Finding Wild Missouri, you'll see short episodes of my car and I going out to rivers and streams and various wild spots, prairies in Missouri, walking with the prairie chickens and the buffalo.
We've got, in western Missouri, we've got some great prairies, prairie chickens, prairie flowers.
Prairie State Park.
Yes.
Wonderful place.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
We're very fortunate, I think, in Missouri to have our state parks and our Department of Conservation well funded. We're very fortunate to have such high quality places to visit.
Once we destroy them, they're gone forever. And we've learned that about the prairies. And the Department of Conservation has done a great job of trying to preserve and in some cases restore not only lands, but populations as well. Now, sometimes people may have a differing view about what they've done, but you can't argue with the success of restoring the wild turkey population in Missouri, which was decimated, deer as well, and various other elements of the population. I was down at Peck Ranch down in southern Missouri. Yes, and the elk are fascinating. People are scared of elk because they're such big animals, but they're also smart animals, and they stay away from highways. They act a little bit different than deer, and thank goodness for that, because you don't want to run into an elk.
They're a little bigger.
But magnificent animals.
I'm afraid we could talk for a long time, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have for tonight. And I'd like to say thanks to you, John, for being with us, and thanks to Jay and Kim Fischer for taking time to visit with us as well. But before we go, we'd also like to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in to Show Me Ag. We hope you'll tune in next time for another look at a topic touching rural Missouri. For everyone here at KMOS and myself, good night.